So we're going to talk today about answering settler colonialism, right? It's a very prominent critique on this topic. And before we go about doing that, I want to get some of the fundamental arguments that we'll be answering. So like think a little bit about the neg here, and use that to set up the set of arguments that we'll need as part of our AF responses. So let's talk a little bit about and kind of brainstorm what are the key features that you all see of this as a negative argument. So what arguments do we expect to be answering? What are some of the features that are important?
Lane, alternative, and health improvement.
I agree that those are the kind of like debate strategic categories. So let's think a little bit about what those look like in this circumstance. So what are kind of the core underlying aspects of the negative argument? What are the parts of settler colonialism?
Something that the affirmative does will like encroach on indigenous land, culture, resources, etc. And I guess like replace whatever like indigenous peoples, instead of having what their culture is there, they'll just like replace it with their own like settler ideas.
Okay, so you used the language of encroachment. What terminology might we expect to find for encroachment in the negative evidence? I know. Conquest. That we would expect to find a set of arguments about the way in which then, you think about this also as settlement. Anybody remember from Julian's topic lecture why are we talking about settler colonialism and what is this notion of settlement here? Why is that an important part of this negative argument?
Rather than, I guess, other forms of colonization and colonialism, settler colonialism actively dispossesses the native people rather than living alongside them.
Okay. So dispossession, that's language that we might expect to find in the negative cards, rather than, or like prior to or different than the language of exploitation. Okay? You better remember from the topic lecture that notion of like you go away versus you work for me. Okay? Working for me, that could be a form of exploitation, as in I'm getting more out of your work than you are. Okay? And I'm exploiting you, I'm taking something from you. Dispossession, okay, and what's the, like if we're talking about settlement, what is the focal point of dispossession in this context? Land. Okay, that is that when talking about the difference between settler societies versus other examples of colonialism, you might be talking about a desire for land that is gained through the process of dispossession. So that the settler now occupies land or territory that was previously occupied by indigenous inhabitants. Okay? What can anybody think of an example of colonialism that doesn't involve dispossession of land, or where dispossession of land is an ancillary or like minor part of the project of colonialism?
Like when affirmatives take away indigenous knowledge.
I'm talking less here about an affirmative and more about like historically, can we think of examples of colonialism that doesn't really use this language of settler colonialism?
Like when high schools use Native American mascots instead.
So that is taking place against the backdrop of a settler colonial society. Okay, so like for both of these examples, it's like, yes, land is not the thing that is at stake, but the settler society is the backdrop for that. So we can talk about mascots or example of like knowledge production as occurring within a settler society. Those are also things, it's like it's reasonable to think of some of those things as connected to, other forms of colonialism that aren't directly about dispossession from the land, but could we understand in the US, or according to this argument, could we understand in the US either like why mascots have often used indigenous peoples or why high schools have often used indigenous peoples as a mascot without understanding settlement? Right, it's like oftentimes that is literally about the like, oh, this is named after the people who used to live here, right? So in some ways that is connected to land. I'm thinking more historically, can you think of examples of like colonial societies that were not designed primarily around settlement?
Like, the Congo.
Okay, talk to me a little bit about that example of the Congo.
Like, Belgium was exploiting the Congo for like rubber plantations, but they weren't dispossessing the people.
Right, there was not a large-scale project of Belgian settlement in the Congo, okay? The tremendously exploitative, right, a genocide, but not an example of dispossession in terms of conquest of the land, as like, oh, they're gonna go be a bunch of Belgians who live in the Congo, right? A minor part of, it's like there are Belgians who are overseeing that kind of project of exploitation, but not the notion that it's like Belgium would settle over the long term, like send a lot of people to go live in the Congo. Any other examples?
British India.
Yeah, like if you think of the British colonial kind of administration of India, it's largely done by having a small number of British colonial officials and placing those officials and using kind of British military and commercial might to exploit, right, substantial portions of the Indian population to kind of set up industries and at the time factories. Okay, it's not what you think of as like an automobile plant or something, but like the factor is a commercial institution where you have colonial officials governing the commerce in the area, but not a substantial example of settlement, right? Like if you think about India today, is there a substantial British population that like went to India and stayed there, lived there, built cities, tried to build an independent society that would be labeled as like, oh, this is an outpost of Britain or an example of Britain here in India? No, right? So that I want to get at this word is doing something different here in that not all forms of colonialism are projects of settler colonialism, okay? And so when people describe this as like, this is a different analytic or a different approach to understanding colonialism, they're trying to draw attention to certain features, in particular dispossession of land, as in the objective is to settle there, to stay on the land that has been dispossessed from indigenous peoples, okay? Do we see how the US fits this model? Okay, right, so like the objective, you presumably in your various US history classes learned about the process of establishing various British colonies in North America. Those were established with the objective of long-term settlement, okay, and that would involve obtaining land in order to like house people, build cities, like build colonies, build plantations, like all of those are portions of British settler colonialism that when people refer to the US as a settler society, they're talking about it as an outcome of this project of settlement, okay, and dispossession and taking land, okay? So what are the other kind of, if this is sort of the most fundamental portion of understanding somebody trying to draw the distinction between colonialism and settler colonialism, what are the other kind of key features that we would expect the negative to talk about strategically based on this analytical framework? What arguments are we going to hear from the neg about why, if this analytic or this paradigm of colonialism is distinct, that has distinct strategic implications for editing?
A lot of the alternatives are very radical in the sense that we have to actively decolonize America by giving back the land or having a revolution, so that's strategic because it might be incompatible with the communication.
Yeah, right? if we see conquest and dispossession, right, as key features of a project of settlement, then it is not surprising that a variety of the alternative arguments would be phrased in terms of compromising approaches to this process of dispossession and control of land, okay? Thus, you oftentimes will get the language, and I'm gonna put a few key examples of these terms up here. Refusal, okay? I imagine that you all have heard arguments about a politics of refusal, okay? This is like, what's being refused here? So, yeah.
Sometimes state action, sometimes common sense. I use it as a given.
Yeah, the political and legal framework of the settler's state, okay? As in we'll talk about some examples of kind of like what you might contrast refusal with in terms of this, but like this is, so for example, what is one of the legal categories that is used in US law? Does anybody know kind of the legal status of, or any important historical legal status for tribal governments in the US?
I know that like for citizenship, it only gets passed down from like up to like a certain generation. So like, if, let's say that you were fully indigenous, at one point, if you like married a non-indigenous person, you're at one point where like your descendants stop being indigenous and they don't have like their identification.
Well, so tribal identification and like tribal membership are typically determined by the tribes themselves, okay? And I'm highlighting here that those are political entities for the most part in the United States. Alaska is actually sort of an exception to this generalized approach to indigenous settler relations in US legal code, okay? But tribal membership is, like, that is an example of the way in which, some of these features might, but it's generally not regarded as a purely like ethnic identity or racial identity. There's a political category or political relationship that's happening between the US and tribal governments. Does anybody know the historic, like, the Supreme Court doctrine, the kind of like the issues that govern the relations between the state and the tribes?
Isn't Native, wasn't at least used to be considered sovereign states, they used to be separate from the United States. I'm not
Okay.
sure if that's been overturned. I know like in the 19th century, they were considered sovereign and Andrew Jackson had problems with it and there was,
Okay.
yeah.
We're getting there, right? So we've got, initially, this is an encounter between sovereign entities, okay? So for example, you've probably heard about the violations of different treaty obligations in a treaty between the US and various different tribal governments. Are we familiar with this concept? Okay, that's a treaty relationship because that's a relationship between two sovereign political entities, right? The US doesn't sign treaties, but the US does not sign a treaty with a corporation. Do we get that? Right, like it signs treaties with other states, so implicitly that recognizes them as political actors who are independent sovereign nations. Okay, you're getting at Jackson, Trail of Tears. Around this same time period, we have a change in the legal status of many tribal governments in the US. It's later, but we're getting at something important. They know the term. I might point out that it could be significant that we don't know this terminology in the sense that like this has probably not been like a focal point for US, like the US educational system does not spend a great deal of time talking about some of the underlying political concepts that you find in the encounter between settler society and indigenous peoples, in part because it's like it could be narrated as like you might know specific examples of either genocidal activity or dispossession, or examples of like, there are disputes over the kind of viability and ethics of indigenous mascots, but that's a little bit different than kind of narrating the political history of the US in relationship to tribal governments, which would require acknowledging them as sovereign actors. So the Supreme Court ruling, and a couple of important terms from Supreme Court rulings that come through here are the notion that tribal governments are domestic dependent nations. Okay? And that the relationship between the federal government and these tribal entities is generally governed by the trust doctrine. Okay? As in, what strikes you about this terminology of domestic dependent nations? It stands out there. Like, why are each of those words there?
Well,
Each take one.
I was gonna pick dependent.
Okay.
It illustrates the hierarchy where the United States still has this, not governing authority, but still has power over the indigenous nations as it's them who gets to determine whether or not they're sovereign.
Right?
In a sense.
Yeah, the point of contrast here is with independent, right? So like dependent nations, that means that they are, this is a political relationship of subordination, okay? That the tribal governments don't enjoy independence. So for example, that a tribal government, in this interpretation, could a tribal government continue to sign treaties with other states? Like, could the, Standing Rock tribe, could they sign a treaty with Britain under this arrangement? No. Okay, so dependent rather than independent.
I was also going to take my shot at trust doctrine.
Okay.
I think probably it sort of implies that the indigenous people should just trust the government and do what's right for them.
There's a little bit of that. This is a relationship basically of like the government is entrusted with essentially care and supervision of the tribes. Okay, so you're right that does imply some degree of like this is a reciprocal arrangement of like your well-being is entrusted to us, and likewise you should trust them that we are looking out for your best interests. Okay, and you're also getting, I think, at some of the ways in which this notion of the other thing that's going on here. Anybody know the connection between the trust doctrine and land? The land, this is, and I'm having to paint with a pretty broad brush here, okay? Like, federal Indian law is like a really, really complex and fairly interesting area. So there's a lot of details that we're glossing over, but just want to get into some of the background, okay? The land for the tribal governments is held in trust. So it's actually owned by the federal government as so presumably you've heard of a trust fund. Okay, is this is something that's being held on someone else's behalf, right? Like some of you might have money from your grandparents or something that's like, oh yeah, I don't get to choose what to do with it, okay, but I know eventually it will be mine. In this case, okay, the land is entrusted to the federal government the federal government will administer it and own it on behalf of the tribes. So an example of a legal doctrine in which settlement and dispossession has been legally codified is not only, so the land that is reservation land is typically held in trust, okay, by the federal government. The tribes don't own the land. Domestic, what's the contrasting term here? So domestic instead of, foreign, right? International. So that this is a framework no longer of interactions between states, okay, or between sovereign entities, but instead, once again, that aspect of subordination. These are now nations, not states, that are a part of the United States. Okay, they should be regarded as domestic in the sense that they are no longer foreign entities. They are part of and controlled by and administered by the United States. So for the tribal governments who are interacting legally and politically with the U.S. government, okay, this set of constitutional doctrines, and they're, like I said, painted with a very broad brush. There are examples like the recent McGirt decision has some very interesting implications for kind of administration of the land and the legal status of Oklahoma. But under these, I want to talk about this as an example of why an alternative might be interested in refusal, okay? That is, you could choose to use this set of legal and political categories, right, as in order to make a legal claim, for instance, about like what is owed under certain treaties, or whether or not, the tribal governments have the ability to administer the reservation land in particular ways, or like, do they have the, like, if a tribal police force arrests someone, under which law and in which courts will they appear, under whose law will they be prosecuted? Like, all of these are examples of the ways in which, in order to use any of the legal and political machinery of the United States, a number of the categories that govern the legal status of indigenous peoples and indigenous governments have to be used. So this language of refusal most oftentimes is being directed at concepts like this. That is, that the legal and political categories that govern the settler state should be refused, okay? Should not use those categories. They cannot be used strategically. Terminology that is adjacent to this is the language of resurgence, okay? As in, there should be, like, indigenous people should build upon these, like, refuse the set of categories that are part of settler society. Resurgence is a use of indigenous political categories or indigenous political thought, as in the legal and political categories that govern indigenous struggle should be separate from the legal and political concepts used in settler society. So for instance, resurgence here is oftentimes juxtaposed with, or is not the same as, the language of self-determination. Okay, self-determination might pursue the like, that tribal governments should become sovereign, independent nations. Well, if you think sovereignty is a category that is part of settler society, then resurgence would say that sovereignty is not a meaningful category for reclaiming the rights that were extinguished during settlement and dispossession. Does that connection make some sense? Like, an alternate vocabulary, an alternate set of categories are necessary. Somebody highlighted that land return is often a key element of this, which you could understand if dispossession, okay, and thus administration, ownership, and a trust relationship to indigenous land is an important legal and political category in the US. You can understand why land return might function as an important political demand against the tenets of settler society. Strategically, what does the negative, so this might be some of the language of the alternative, what does this set up, or what does this language suggest about what the negative gets out of this argument? So, like, what are some strategic benefits that the negative enjoys when using this terminology? What other arguments become easier? What becomes more difficult? What's an AF argument that gets more difficult? Why?
Because they usually have to be compatible with either the material action of the alt or the politics of the alt. That's particularly difficult when the AF affirms both the United States federal government and DDI action within that.
Yeah, like, it's not surprising that a lot of this is written in very uncompromising language. Okay? As in, refusal, right, if you think about kind of why the strategic terminology might be used, and fits fairly well with some of the negative strategy, right, it is difficult to permute this, because it is based on a premise of basically, refusal here is categorical, right, and uncompromising, not the whole point, if we're talking about this, is to contrast it with kind of like, oh, we'll try and wend our way through the existing legal and political categories and use them to our advantage, okay, as indigenous governments or as indigenous peoples, okay, and that refusal there means that permuting this position is very difficult. Okay? What other arguments would we expect to hear or kind of see that would show up in this evidence that are powerfully worded? How many of you have debated this argument before? Okay, well, so what are some of the arguments that we hear on the neg that are supported by the neg's evidence? so decolonization or decolonial thinking, right, that oftentimes is paired with refusal, right? If you think of that as just like, okay, this must be kind of categorical, I would put that kind of similar here as like this makes permutations very difficult, okay? What other, are there any other implications to, when you talk about kind of like where you see the terminology of decolonization or decolonial thinking, what other category of argument on the neg does that raise? Like what type of objection to the AF?
The scholarship is here, but it's.
Okay,
underlying things are always-
which, like, a shorthand for thinking about that category of argument would be what type of objection?
Epistemology.
Yeah. There are a number of epistemic objections here based on the, right, because if many of the arguments are about refusing legal and political categories, then arguments about the ways in which the organization of knowledge about and around relationships with indigenous people has been structured, that is a set of epistemic objections to the AF. Right? That we could say, who gets to produce valid knowledge, what counts as valid knowledge, that is at stake in relationships between the colonizer and the colonized. Okay? What are other negative arguments that we expect to hear here?
Ontology?
Okay. We expect to hear an ontological objection. Talk me through that.
Well, it's, if I'm being honest, in the routes where this has occurred, it tends to run a lot into epistemology. And I know the distinction between the two, but in terms of big arguments, for me, they kind of run. So,
Okay. What are the categories of being that would be particularly important for this argument?
I guess that would be colonizing.
Settler versus native. Right? That if this is treated as a category of being, okay, and what, under this thesis, in which dispossession and settlement are the operating logics of a settler colonialism or a settler colonial society, okay, what is the relationship between these categories ontologically?
Well, there's not many people who want to sacrifice.
What's the relationship between these two? What is the logic, according to this position, that governs their relationship? So if this is the category of being, this was in Julian's topic, where he was talking about, colonialism. Non-being. Because, according to this terminology, okay, settler colonialism is governed by a logic of elimination. When Julian was quoting from, I think it was Veracini, the article on settler colonialism, does anybody remember this phrase, logic of elimination, coming up? What does that mean? So why is it a logic? And why did I put it next to these ontological categories of settler versus native? What is a logic?
The way of thinking about or justifying your actions.
Okay, I think we're close there. Have you all learned any logic? I'm imagining that it was not in your history and social studies classes, probably in a different class. Where did you learn about logic? Okay, you learned about it in math. When you're learning logic in math, what are you learning?
That's the way it's been.
You are learning a set of relationships that are governed by rules, right? So the rules that govern how a different set of pieces can fit together, right? So the logical relation, like the principle of identity is a logical relationship, right? A equals A, okay, I imagine. I imagine you at some point learned the principle of identity in math. Okay, well, here, if we say that this is a logic of elimination and it is, governing a relationship between being and non-being, you might talk about that as, in order for A to exist, B must be eliminated. So that the presence and the being of the settler, because it depends upon dispossession, that requires the elimination of the native. That's what's being made, that is what is being asserted in the argument about a logic of elimination. As in, the way that these two pieces, colonizer, colonized, settler, native, fit together is that in order for one to exist, it must attempt to eliminate the other. That the logical outcome of settlement is elimination and extermination. Note, okay, this could refer to a project of genocide, as in we will eliminate the native inhabitants. It could also refer to a project of cultural genocide, as in the native as an independent way of being or appearing in the world will be eliminated, it will disappear, okay? So that might be where you get into some of the arguments, for instance, about, like, if you have read anything about native schools administered by the federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, what's the thing that you know about those schools? Like, what's the logic kind of operating there? What's going on?
It was more of a form of, I think what you would call it in this lecture, internal colonization, where they would try to erase cultures and languages and histories, particularly through like abuse and just reconfiguring the way they looked at the world.
Okay. Only speaking, like, a requirement that you only speak English, so you eliminate another society's language, right? That you eliminate another society's mode of dress, right? If you've seen any pictures of the attendees of those Indian schools, they're all wearing like clothing typical for the settler of the time, right? Like a lot of like button up kind of like military style clothing, right? Very uniform. You eliminate relationships of kinship, as in you refuse to recognize that anything different from the legal category of marriage and descendants that is the settler legal category, like any alternative kinship relationships or anything that might be used in a political system that is different from basically a single head of household in which a man marries a woman and their descendants are their children and all of that. Like, those legal and political categories begin to govern how you would assign relationships between people, okay? So do we see how that, like, you could say that that is part of a logic of elimination, not in the sense of the person needs to die in a physical sense, but if their culture dies, that you are eliminating an alternative way of being in the world. It's like the language, the mode of dress, the kinship relations, any of the political affiliations that might be connected to any of those things, those are all intended for elimination or disappearance via assimilation, okay? So that's that set of arguments. There's one other kind of major category of negative argument that I'm looking for here that I don't think we've heard so much about yet. Anybody think of it? So all of you raise your hand in terms of you've debated this argument. What is language that's missing from the board so far? Yeah.
Maybe like assimilation.
Well, we talked about that a little bit as kind of here a subset of logic of elimination. I think you're right to say that, like, concerns about assimilation are oftentimes raised by people writing in this area, but that's not what I'm looking for here. I'm looking for a debate strategy category. Sure, that's likely covered by ontology, right? Like, that is part of the way that this framework for this position will be debated. How about root cause? Anybody expect to debate that argument in this position? Okay, right? That the language that might be used here, right? This is part of the argument about both historical prioritization, okay, right? And that's part of the reason that this notion of different logics or logic of elimination is relevant for thinking about this strategic category, root cause, That is, so long as we are part of a society that is governed according to the logic of elimination, a logic of settler society, if that's true, then any AF that is attempting to deal with instances of, like, we could see cards about this in terms of international conflict, we could see cards about this in terms of, like, I assume you've seen that many of these AFs, because the area of the Arctic, like Dr. Birkins presented to us about the amount of research that is currently being done to collaborate with indigenous people in the Arctic, right? Do we see that root cause argument could be very useful in that context of, like, all of this is just kind of occurring on top of the logic of elimination and the process of dispossession. And so if the negative wins a root cause argument about this impact and this way of thinking about the world, then any of the AFs that are designed to remedy specific instances of colonialism should rather be seen as part of a logic of assimilation or a logic of dispossession. So root cause makes it easy for the neg to kind of claim that the impact area, several of the common impact areas that are found in the Arctic topic, that those are things that the negative can kind of control that impact. Does that make sense? Okay. So, I want to talk through some examples of affirmative arguments and cards, and just, part of the reason I want to do this with cards is to walk through some of the alternatives to these terms, some of the criticisms of the way in which this is hashed out. But the reason that I wanted to get all of us thinking on the same page about a lot of the negative arguments is, can we see why, like, for one, this position, a lot of these terms are all linked together in a way that it can advantage the neg in the sense that answering any one part of the affirmatives argument, so long as you can explain any of these core concepts on the neg, there are a lot of different affirmative arguments that can all be grouped together. Does that make sense? Right, so if you win some of these arguments about a logic of elimination or the ontological categories of settler and native, then a lot of what the AF has to say is not particularly relevant, or just doesn't deal with the root cause style thinking that the negative is encouraging the judge to adopt. We all on board for that? So that, in my mind, places a significant priority for the AF on trying to challenge aspects of the analytic or of the paradigm of thinking about settler colonialism in this way, using this conglomeration of terms. Okay, we need to contest some of the fundamentals of the argument in order to make most of the specificity of any of the AF arguments matter. Okay, like that's one of the overall things that the neg has going for it on this set of arguments is like that it can try to turn any instance of the specific into a part of this general argument about the paradigm of settler colonialism or the analytic of settler colonialism for understanding the relationship between settler and native. Yeah? So like the negative here gets to paint with a very broad brush on purpose, right? All of their cards are sort of written in terms of the importance of the underlying structure here. And in fact, I actually want to put another term that we didn't get to up on the board, and that is the language of structure versus event. Has anybody seen this? Can we define its importance or kind of talk about why it's up there? Dan?
Saying it's an event would be like seven colonialism only happened once, and right now we're not in a state of seven colonialism, whereas a structure would define it as seven colonialism is the way we like think about the world and how it structures like other things in society, and like it's like ongoing right now.
Yeah, and this is oftentimes, like, part of the reason that this appears very prominently here is this is part of a disagreement with a number of Marxists in terms of the way that they might think about colonialism as something that sets the stage for capitalism, okay, or as part of an earlier example of capitalist accumulation, okay, so-called primitive accumulation. And instead, you gotta think of this as a structure. Notice, structure and logic, these two terms go together in the sense that it's like, if a logic determines how the different puzzle pieces can fit together, right, then a structure is an example of something that can be built out of those different puzzle pieces. So if we think of settler colonialism as a structure that is governed by a logic of elimination, that means that these pieces can only be put together in such a way that the relationship between settler and native is one of elimination. Okay? since we're, 2 hours for this elective, why don't we take a 7-minute break? Okay, we'll come back and talk through the first set of ath cards. Yeah? Okay. Maybe some jumping jacks or something out in the hallway. Everybody seems a little sleepy.
I'll just check this and then I'll be on.
Please sell up in the hallway. Let's see one computer. Max and Daniel.
So actually looking at this one. Yeah, I was just like,
Okay. So, I want to start talking about some of the AF categories of argument here and walk through some evidence that might help us with the different terminology that we should use for thinking about this argument. So, one of the concepts I wanted to put up here, how many of you have heard of this as, or heard this used as a critique of liberalism or liberal subjectivity? Okay? Can we talk through what that might mean here?
Particularly with the latter phase of recognition, for more, I mean, I think that this word isn't good, but soft left acts,
Okay.
particularly like the indigenous co-op or co-production knowledge or Red Deal, the negative will critique that their attempts at reform are more a facade of re-entrenching the like settler versus native dynamic, just in a less obvious way.
So why the terminology here of recognition? Who's recognizing who? And what does recognition mean? So if I recognize you, what does that mean?
The state is recognizing the settler, but that's often critiqued because it's still a way of like asserting the state's authority over the settler by assuming that they weren't, the state over the, native, by assuming that they weren't valid in the first place.
Right? Okay. Recognition, right? It's like, oh, I recognize who you are. Here, this like part of what we were talking about then is, does recognition perpetuate assimilation? So when we were talking about the kind of legal and political categories of a settler state, okay, as exercised in the law in the US and in US politics, right? Recognition, one way of criticizing that might be that the terms of recognition are already so loaded that they are basically a form of assimilation, okay? You see how that works? So like, recognition might involve some notion of reform or acknowledgement, okay? I think that talking about the cooperation AFs or the, you know, the notion of, like this was also in the Berkins talk, the like, not about us, without us kind of thing, right? A seat at the table. Do we see that a seat at the table might be an example of recognition, as in like, and recognition might also be the like, oh, you are like us, or I recognize that you also are kind of an independent set of peoples who have their own legal and political norms. But recognition, and this is one of the criticisms of this term, might also mean that you are imposing or using the set of terms that were part of the problem to begin with, okay? So like that's this kind of tension between the notion that recognition might actually be a form of assimilation or might continue the logic of elimination. This is why, like, recognition, okay, might be contrasted with the terminology of refusal, okay? Right? Refusal is, I refuse the categories in which you see me, or could recognize my existence. Recognition then is a defense of, you know, that reform and acknowledgement change, like, oh, in the act of recognition, something is changing about the way that I think, or the way, in this case, right, that the settler recognizes or sees something different, and thus changes their own relationship to the native, is part of the way that you might talk about recognition more positively. Other terminology that is connected to this, has anybody seen any discussion of reconciliation? So if I want to reconcile in a relationship, what am I doing? If you reconcile with a,
Just like restoring the relationship.
okay, conciliation, that's right. Conciliation, right? It's like this does not require, like, conciliation does not require friendship per se, right? Or like, oh, we feel great about each other. But if two of you were fighting with each other and I asked you to reconcile, right? It would be to reach a prior state of respect, peace, you know, cooperation rather than enmity. Okay, that's what will be going on with reconciliation. Do we see how this is oftentimes criticized through the language of structure versus event, as in reconciliation here on the negative side might be categorized as reconciliation is too much like acceptance. Okay, because reconciliation implies that somehow you could set right, that you could make this set of relationships just or reciprocal, when in fact, if they were premised on elimination, part of the way that you might talk about structure versus event is this is not something that could ever be reconciled, right? Genocide cannot be repaired. Elimination cannot, there's no possibility of justice after the notion of elimination. So these terms get contrasted with refusal in part because these are strategies that essentially say, well, given the structure of settler society, what can be done about the set of relationships politically and legally between settler and native? Okay? And oftentimes then part of what we're talking about in terms of the theory of this argument is appealing to the specificities of evidence. It's like, so for example, okay, how many of you have heard or have made the argument with one of the AFs that is more about a kind of cooperation or recognition, have heard the argument either, okay, so Sasha mentioned this earlier on that this is perpetuation of colonialism, but how many of you have attempted to make the argument on the AF or heard the AF make the argument that it's like, well, there are specific tribal governments or representatives of tribes that are asking for assistance? Raise your hand. Okay. Do we see how it's like that is an appeal to a specific aspect of the relationship that the negative evidence and kind of the discussion on the neg of this argument is that this set of specific relationships does not matter so long as it is governed by a theory that could only produce recognition or reconciliation, because these are examples of things that do not address the fundamental logic of assimilation of settler colonial society. So I hope that strategic pattern makes sense, that part of the appeal to specificity of this is a set of people who have asked for this assistance, or here's an opportunity for cooperation. Well, if cooperation and reconciliation are the same thing, and reconciliation implies that something that was fundamentally unjust can be rectified or can be made right, okay, do you see how it's like the appeal to specificity on its own can be a difficult kind of path versus this argument, because it is designed to take some of those specific instances of relationship and treat them as this is representative of a larger underlying logic of elimination. There are always representatives that you could choose, or people who are willing to pursue a strategy of assimilation or recognition, and that's part of the problem, is that that set of legal and political categories produces the same thing that was underlying in the relationship to begin with. So my contention is that for the AF, part of what we want is some theoretical evidence that gets at why these strategies might not be totally unacceptable, or the other thing that's important to make some of those appeals to specificity work, okay, is we have to say that it is bad to treat settler colonialism as an independent paradigm that defines all of the different logical pieces and the only ways in which they could fit together. Does that make, defeating the argument that we should understand settler colonialism as an overwhelming logic that can only work in one way, that is an argument that is very important to beat in order to make any of these other appeals to AF specificity matter, okay? Those two in fact go hand in hand. The more that the AF wants to say, here are specific instances in which the plan might be a good idea in terms of the relationship that it forms between a settler government and indigenous peoples, needs or wants to have an argument that is we should not treat the relationships between the settler state and indigenous peoples as governed by one logic that always works the same way and can only have one outcome. So in order to make a bunch of those AF arguments work, you want theoretical answers that say it is not good to think about settler colonialism as having one underlying logic that always has the same outcome. So we need some AF cards that explain this. This could take the form of, accepting some of the link arguments, because, let me put it this way, is no link a viable strategy here? Not so much, right? Do we get that just do we get why link is the easy part of the argument for the neg to win here? Right? So rather than contesting the link argument as like, AF is not colonial, okay, in terms of the negative position, it needs to be, shouldn't think of the world as operating according to one settler colonial logic. Therefore, the AF can have outcomes that are not colonialism. Like you have to, those two arguments have to work together. If we wanted to defend the terminology of recognition or reconciliation, part of what we would need to say then is reconciliation or recognition could end up in a different place than elimination. So we need a defense of the notion of recognition or reconciliation. I want to show a couple examples of cards that use some of this terminology. One, I'm going to start with a card that, while I don't think that it's not the card that I would read first on this position, I want it here as an example of like, how does a liberal political theorist talk about the issue of the underlying injustice of colonialism, or like why it is and how it is that you could think about that as a relationship that is, you know, amenable to reconciliation or repair. Is that right? It's just like, what does a card like this look like is kind of the thing that I want to talk through first. Okay? So this is, Duncan Iveson is writing in the Australian context, and so, you know, one of the other things that's important to keep in mind is that from the paradigm of settler colonial theory, societies like Australia, South Africa, Canada, the United States, like all of them share the underlying feature of having been parts of projects of settlement. Okay, so that's part of the reason it's not unusual. Like all of those examples that Julian talked about, like Patrick Wolf is an Australian, like writing in the on the neg side of this argument. It is not uncommon to see Australians in particular arguing about this, or Canadians, because these are all societies that face the dilemma of like what to do in the aftermath of, we are a settler society and our history is one of settler colonialism. What do we do about that? Audra Simpson in this volume suggests that a better alternative to the politics of recognition is one of refusal. Okay, Audra Simpson wrote some of the very early cards on refusal that you would see as like negative alternative cards. That's why they're phrased in that way. So we're talking about a card that is responding to this notion of refusal. Okay? To refuse to play the game of recognition altogether. Others explore a middle ground where indigenous people in settler and non-settler states attempt to reconcile complex and sometimes competing impulses for and against recognition. By contrast, I will try and establish the conditions under which cross-cultural normative frameworks within which to justify, legitimate, and transform the exercise of political power in several colonial states might emerge. However, insofar as refusal shifts the burden of justification from indigenous peoples to the state and the international system in which the states reside, it shares a similar starting point. So the terms of this argument are, Iveson's going to try and explain recognition or reconciliation not as like, oh, sometimes you should pursue refusal, sometimes recognition, like this is a strategic choice. He's trying to make the argument that if we started from the point of settler society must justify itself or provide some degree of legitimacy. What's legitimacy in this context? What does that mean? To have legitimacy. If legitimacy is an adjective, what's the concept that you might associate legitimacy with the most? How is it being used here? Frameworks in which to justify, legitimate, and transform the exercise of political power in settler colonial states.
Like how recognized it is, how
Respected,
respected.
okay, so like authority, I was going to say authority and power are typically concepts that we would see connected to legitimacy, okay? So if power is being exercised with some legitimacy, that means that it is respected and recognized as legitimate, right? It's like, it is proper, okay? So, for example, okay, hopefully the adults at DDI exercise their authority in a way that you all treat as legitimate. It's like, okay, we get to tell you some of the boundaries of what you can and can't do. If you did not recognize the legitimacy of our authority and you're like, you can't tell me what to do, okay? We would have the recourse of calling your parents, and they would be like, well, they do get to tell you what to do, or you have to come home, okay? Right? So think of that as an example of legitimacy. Like, legitimacy requires the recognition or respect that that is a power or authority that is being exercised properly, okay? When it says refusal shifts the burden of justification from indigenous peoples to the state, what does that mean? So this is discussing the framework of refusal. What does it mean to shift the burden of justification? Justification here is being used as a synonym for legitimacy. That's why it's justify, legitimate, and transform. So justification, what's being justified here?
The state taking charge of this action?
The political power. The power that the state exercises, that's what's being recognized as legitimate. Okay? Why would, I don't understand, why does this share a similar start, why does his argument share a similar starting point as refusal? Because he's clearly trying to get at a different, like, he's not saying refusal good, he's trying to contrast his argument with Simpson's notion of refusal. So what's the starting point?
So I think both are trying to undermine, I guess, the state, but in his sort of strategy, he wants to force the state to justify its abuses of indigenous people.
Okay, I would push back a little bit against undermine, because if part of what he's talking about here is how would we reach legitimacy, okay? I don't think that he's talking about undermining legitimacy, but burden of justification, okay? It's in order to exercise power or authority, it must be justified. And here, if we shift it, okay, the burden of justification to the state, okay, rather than the burden of justification, where would the alternate burden of justification lie? So it lies with the state instead of indigenous people, okay? The burden of justification being placed on indigenous people, do we see how that's that's part of an example of this logic of elimination argument, is you must justify your own existence, okay? And during much of the historical period of the United States, you could say that the state viewed that justification as a failure. It's basically you are not civilized people, therefore your existence is not justified. It is not legitimate, okay? And actually, the United States, in terms of its relationship with different tribal governments, this relationship was different at different times. Is anybody familiar with the concept of the civilized tribes? Several people nodded. Where does that come from? What is that?
Within the state trying to subject the tribes to become part of the United States.
Can you think of some example tribes?
I can think of an example try to the school system, the native school system, trying to get native children into this American school system and quote unquote civilize them.
This is a little earlier, okay? In some of the U.S.'s relationships with different tribal governments, okay, including the Cherokee, okay? So part of the reason for the Trail of Tears and the argument about the dispossession of the Cherokee lands in Georgia, okay, up until that point, the Cherokee were recognized as a tribe that would continue to enjoy the ownership of their land. They were treated as a civilized tribe because, does anybody know one of the major reasons that they were identified as a civilized tribe in their dealings with the U.S.?
Because they adopted more Western beliefs. Just being,
Like what?
they changed how they dress.
Okay, so changes in dress and fashion.
Language, trade.
Alphabet, alphabetizing the Cherokee language was a significant aspect of civilized people are literate. If you can translate the Cherokee language into an alphabet and provide a syllabary, okay, I can never say that word correctly, but basically the version of a dictionary but for phonemes, okay, you can write out the language and turn it into a language that can be used in a form of literacy, okay? It's I use this as just an example of that's an example of, and admittedly the burden of justification there it's that that justification was insufficient to overcome the desire to dispossess the Cherokee people of their land once gold was discovered in northern Georgia, okay? But point being, this burden of justification at different times in the relationship between settler society and native societies there is an argument for it did not always work exactly the same way, okay? Or just like, I wanted an example here of, okay, if we share the starting point of refusal and this burden shifts, what does that mean? What's the goal here? Shifting it to the settler state, what does that do?
Accountability?
Yeah, right? Like part of this is an argument for how would you make a state or a society accountable for its past crimes, for injustice, okay? So the notion here is like recognition or reconciliation do not entail papering over the idea that colonization is an event that is long past and can instead be treated as a structure. Like this is an argument that recognition or reconciliation provides a way to address some of the underlying negative impact about settler colonialism, insofar as it says, yeah, this is a structure that must be met then with justification. When we think about the exercise of political power in settler societies, we must shift the burden of justification onto the settler state, okay? If you wanted to go through and read this article, I think there's an interesting, it's like, we're summarizing here the critique of recognition, which we already sort of went over, right? Who is recognizing whom and on what basis? The concern here is that casting claims of indigenous peoples as claims for recognition by the state or the broader political community is something of a trap. Indigenous political theorists, including Simpson, have developed powerful versions of this critique. The basic version is that the history of colonialism makes mutual recognition impossible. Fanon made a devastating case for this early on. The colonial master is not dependent on the slave, as Hegel thought, that's the master-slave relationship, for securing his own self-consciousness, but rather needs their work and their territory. The colonial subject subjects himself to a regime of recognition in which he internalizes the gaze of the colonizer. Okay? Coulthard, this is another settler colonial theorist or theorist of settler colonialism. Coulthard summarizes it. What results is the absurd paradoxes of the injustices of colonialism, generating the grounds for yet more colonial interventions. This is a summary of the negative argument. Yeah, that's why I've only underlined a sentence of it here, because the negative is going to make this argument for us. Okay. The recognizer exercises the power over the recognizee in having the capacity to grant recognition. Are there other frameworks available for thinking about the nature of justice and legitimacy in settler states like Australia? Power and justification. It is still not clear that liberal political theorists really do put power at the heart of their analysis. If they did, they would shift the onus of justification from resting mainly with indigenous communities to one owed by the state. People should be conceived as not as recipients, but as agents of justice. Okay? So the notion here is that there is agency and mutual agency in recognition, potentially. As in, this isn't governed by the recognizer always has power over the recognizee. The shift is from a focus on recognition to power and relations of justification. That is, recognition transforms into justification. The conditions in which people are able to demand justification of the power exercised over them. Okay? A right justification. Every norm appealed to in order to legitimize the use of force must be reciprocally and generally valid, justified by reciprocally and generally non-objectionable reasons. When justifying the allocation of rights and resources, I cannot claim rights or resources that are denied to others, and I cannot simply impose my reasons on others in making those claims. Okay? Political communities are not only a plurality of cultures and peoples, but also of normative orders. That's part of this liberalism argument, is like, we don't know what the good life is. We don't know for sure, like, different people believe that what the good life is different. That's what it means to have a plural society, right? We have all these different interpretations. So if we're not deciding on one version of the good life, that means that we also have different normative orders. There is disagreement over what's good and how to achieve it. What is normative order? Goes through definition, yada, yada, yada. back and read this article. Political decisions need to be responsive to valid claims about what ought to be done. The problem of political legitimacy is not only to adjudicate between conflicting wills, but to identify correct judgment about what ought to be done. What's that summarizing on the AF side? What is political judgment about what ought to be done if we're translating it into the language of debate? Fiat. Should. We should be, like, how many of you have heard, they're like, no, we shouldn't be debating about what ought to be done. Okay, like that's the basis for any negative criticism of fiat. Here we have an argument that's like, no, we should be, political thinking ought to engage in what ought to be done. Political decisions that recommend genocide or violations of human rights are not legitimate because they result in actions that fail to treat individuals as self-originating sources of valid claims, that is, people who have different claims over what is the good life. Rather, they are illegitimate because they are wrong, independently of what people might will or not will. The force of normative facts somehow reach through our will formation to help form judgments about validity and legitimacy. Okay, I'm gonna keep skipping here a little bit. One danger of abandoning a belief-based conception of political legitimacy completely is that we have the risk of nothing to say about political legitimacy at all. If there is no available normative authority, then either collective decision-making is impossible or all political decisions are illegitimate. Meaning, what is the consequence of never using this notion of recognition, legitimacy, and justification? If no political decision can be justified, okay, what happens according to this?
It will continue to stay the same as it is. It needed to be back for
You have no ability to decide what to do, and no means of choosing between different decisions. So, if our political categories can't give us a way of choosing between different courses of action, okay, we don't ever think that there is a way that you can exercise power legitimately, we will have no power to do anything. Okay, that's what it means by collective decision making. We won't be able to do the things together that we need to be able to do. Public justification creates the conditions for emergence of new multi-personal reasons. Multi-personal reasons are reasons that can be endorsed from a range of different perspectives that emerge from bottom-up, though ongoing, historically situated, multi-perspectival public reasoning as opposed to top-down, state-based reasoning. What category of evidence from the AF does multi-perspectival public reasoning as opposed to top-down, state-based reasoning refer to? We have already talked about this category of AF argument.
Is it like individual people's advocating for?
There are many people who want activity on the, like, they are reasoning that the plan ought to be done, right? That this isn't something that is coming purely from the directive of national interest, like the US wants to build a radar station here, but instead they're like, hey, we want more information about how to adapt to climate change. We should research this together. Like, this is that argument translated into the theoretical language of this is consistent with placing the burden on the settler state to have to justify the exercise of its power rather than treating state-based reasoning or national interest in a top-down fashion as dictating what will happen. Does that make sense then as if it shifts the burden, and this is consistent with the starting point of refusal, as in it shifts the burden. This means that we would have from multiple different perspectives, we would have to verify that this is a legitimate instance of the use of power and authority. In this case, the power to tax and then distribute resources, because those resources will be used in ways that can be justified from a variety of these different perspectives, in a plural society, rather than imposed top-down by a settler state that sees its interests as overwhelming those of different peoples who are part of that society. This is a number of these specific AF arguments translated into why does the theory of justification, recognition, or reconciliation not always produce a logic of elimination? Does That makes sense? Political legitimacy needs to be pluralized, right? The focus should be of a resolutely anti-colonial and egalitarian political theory. Seems to call for enactments of forms of indigenous sovereignty and normativity located on the outside of liberal democratic processes altogether. That is too problematic, if only given the aspirations of many indigenous peoples themselves. How do we create new resonances between these multiple normativities and communities, new modes of solidarity required to address and then identify and then address domestic and global injustices? So if the impact argument is the lack of resources is unjust, then part of the argument about the aspirations of many indigenous peoples and the formation of new forms of solidarity is consistent with the notion of an anti-colonial political theory rather than an assimilative one. Okay? So we have theoretical evidence that answers the claim that a logic of recognition or reconciliation always ends in genocide. I want to talk through what some of the criticisms of, so if part of what I'm trying to make the case for here is, well, we need criticisms of some of the basic terminology of settler colonial theory as a paradigm, okay? Notice, this, and we don't have time even in a 2-hour elective to go through like all of the military cases. Do we see how it's like, I'm talking about a set of AF cards that don't really apply to any of the military cases that much, okay? That set of arguments, there you would need arguments that are basically, that try to sever the epistemic conclusions from the ontological ones, in that you would say colonialism is not a Western logic, or like Western thinking is not, colonialism and Western thinking are not intrinsically tied together, because colonialism and hierarchy are features of all forms of relationships between states. Like part of the military AF approach here would be something that has a view of the kind of colonialism as a tragic outcome in all interstate relationships. That is, hierarchy is not a feature of Western thinking. It is a process of, like, it is part of an underlying process of all human relations, because power and the exercise of power in hierarchical manners is inevitable. Okay, that is not a set of arguments that I'm going over here, but just like, do we see how this is a set of arguments that is designed to kind of, it's using the language of liberalism rather than a conservative understanding of the kind of power is always exercised in a hierarchical manner. The best that we can hope for is to kind of manage the tragic way in which that plays out. Like that is a set of cards that justify hierarchy and predominance in international relations. That like hegemony solves conflicts or deters escalation. All of those are basically grounded in that style of argument. That's not the one that I'm having that I'd have the time to cover here. Okay. I want to talk about logic of elimination for a moment, because it seems like to me that this is the neg argument. It's like we need to have something that basically says, well, the world doesn't work according to the binary pattern that the neg has set up, because if it does, then all of their root cause arguments, right, those all fall into place. So we want something that criticizes the framework of logic of elimination. I want to choose, I'll choose 2 examples of what a card like this might look like. Okay. The distinction between settler and native is politically charged and important, okay? However, it has been analytically and historically constraining, coordinating histories of indigenous dispossession from those of slavery, indentureship, other forced migrations. As in, if we set this up as an ontological distinction, okay, the historical categories in which we are trying to understand, this is an argument for, we should not treat dispossession as totally distinct from other forms of colonialism. We should see them as interrelated, rather than treating this as an entirely paradigmatic, separate issue. Dualisms cannot grasp settler colonialism's historical dependence on transatlantic slavery, forced non-European migration, and its political, economic, and legal connections to extractive and administrative colonies. Notice, colonialism has operated as a system in which exploitation and dispossession are tied together rather than treated as totally separate. So we should not treat them as paradigmatically or analytically entirely separate. This goes into part of the historical justification for that connection, okay? The ongoing emphasis on settlers and natives obscures the disorderly conditions and entanglements produced by changing objectives of imperialism, colonialism, and global capitalism. That is, there isn't one underlying logic. There are a lot of different connections that can be found between different instances and forms of colonialism. The logic of elimination that has become a hallmark of settler colonial studies demands critical attention. Fortifying the settler-native binary, elimination does not sufficiently address the shifting, heterogeneous, and deeply contested asymmetries of legal and colonial power. Okay, so what do we mean here? We mean that there are aspects of this paradigm for studying the history that become self-fulfilling. That you begin to read the history entirely through the logic of elimination in the binary. You find the evidence for that. This is a critique of the negative's epistemic arguments. That is, settler colonial theory has been plagued by a refusal to consider historical evidence that treats these relationships as shifting and heterogeneous, okay, as part of asymmetries in colonial and legal power, rather than as one long continuous logic. So, example, that's the claim, here's one of the warrants. During the long 19th century, peoples, commodities, and ideas and legalities were continuously in motion, connecting British and Anglo-imperial worlds and facilitating unpredictable and unforeseeable alliances. To survive and prosper in distant, remote, and foreign outpost, colonial authorities and European colonists relied extensively on indigenous communities for knowledge, sexual companionship, political and legal support. In some locales, indigenous peoples were enlisted into colonial bureaucracies as police officers, translators, intermediaries, expanding the reach of colonial legal control. Note, this is an argument for binary doesn't capture that sometimes dependence goes the other way. That assimilation can also be an act of agency, as in an agent chooses to assimilate or join a colonial bureaucracy. How do we understand such a person from within the perspective of there's a binary between the settler and the native? Okay. Scholars writing in settler colonial studies have often referred to the law in abstract terms as Western, European, and colonial. These claims have been less attuned to specific legal techniques and instruments through which colonialism dispossessed. The point is not that law is absent from settler colonial studies, far from it. Centering law and legality that actively challenges and even undermines the orderly divides between settler-native, colony-settler society, and land-sea. As in, this also does not capture it's an inaccurate picture of law in politics. Its effects have been variegated and unpredictable. Good example of a card where if you want to know some of the case studies to talk about in cross-ex or be able to answer some questions about the details of this, you need to go back through cards like this to understand some of those examples in case studies, okay? Given their orientation to close archival readings, legal histories of colonialism have effectively responded to several limitations of settler colonial studies. As many scholars contend, dispossession and resettlement were never established on monolithic or uniform expressions of law, legality, or sovereignty, whereas colonial bureaucrats in Australia and British Columbia approached the land as uninhabited and empty. British colonials in New Zealand and Fiji tacitly acknowledged the presence of indigenous peoples. Colonies and settler societies were never governed by a monolith of European or Western law, but through a plurality of laws that drew on competing sources of legal authority. Law was anything but a singularity. Laws were applied in social and legal variation in response to local circumstances. Colonial jurisdictions were never empty surfaces upon which European laws were imposed or projected. So, part of what you're trying to do here is make the argument that root cause or singular logic, those are deceptive or incomplete accounts of the history of colonialism. why is that important? Like, if that's true in terms of the historical evidence and historical operations of colonialism, you're like, Turner, this doesn't matter because none of these cards say that colonialism is not relevant, right? None of them are arguments that colonialism is unimportant. But why should this matter for some of the categories of AFs that we've been talking about? Like, what about this argument then helps the AF in approaching this overall argument about settler colonialism?
Yeah, it could be an example of like, if like the state being used for something good.
I think that, I hear that, okay? Is this the card that you would read for like instances of state good? No. So, I understand where you're getting at, or kind of like why it would be there. I think that this argument is still very useful or important for a pretty different reason. We'll get to the state in a second.
Their characterization of settler colonialism is wrong because they generalize it, and that's not like reflective of what is happening in the US.
Okay, I agree with your summary, but I want to replace the word wrong, okay? Because what happens when, okay, how many of you have been in a debate where it's like you read a card, for instance, on this critique that is like, settler colonial theory wrong, okay? How easy is that to explain as a 2AR argument? Like, what do you do with that argument?
Well, it's not.
How often does a judge begin a decision with, well, I voted AF because settler colonial theory is wrong? Do you hear that decision a lot? Okay, that's like part of the reason is that like you're intuitively getting at something which is, it's like, yes, this is an argument about why the historical evidence is not being used correctly.
Yeah.
It can be difficult to, so what we have to do is translate that into debate strategy. That's why I phrase this as like, we should not think in terms of root causes and singular logics. Those are deceptive and incomplete examples of historical evidence being used to understand colonialism. So the AF's arguments about Western ways of knowing and epistemology or Western categories of being should be rejected. We should never use root cause as a way to understand the operation of colonialism. What is the strategic now? What's the strategic consequence of we should never use the logic of root cause in understanding colonialism, or like a singular logic? What argument is back in play for the AF? Perm, we'll get there in a moment. I think that you're right that there's some way you could use that. What category of AF cards are back in play that the neg was trying to just like exclude from consideration altogether? How did the neg use these arguments about Western knowledge or Western notions of being to like exclude a bunch of AF evidence, or like what were they using these arguments for? How many of you have heard the framework argument that is like the AF is an object of scholarship and research that we need to criticize, that if it's part of settler colonialism, then it must be rejected? Okay, well, under their framework, if the scholarly and historical evidence that is being used to support the theory of settler colonialism is misapplying and reading that history in very simplistic terms that should not and cannot be used because they're not supported by a historical record, what does that mean about their framework argument?
It's like
Same, okay, wrong and two total, like, we're getting at some of the same underlying features. It's like translated into strategy. We should not use the framework of settler colonial studies for establishing what is and isn't legitimate research or legitimate categories of being. There was never such a thing as one unifying Western logic or law playing out in all these different colonial societies, and even within settler colonial societies, there are important differences that have to be taken into account in the historical record. So applying a singular logic to them distorts that record and violates their own framework of having appropriate scholarly evidence for talking about colonialism. Like, make the next step of trying to apply it to their category of strategy, right? It's like, it should come through, and this is, I think you were right to consider the permutation, but like, do you see how we're kind of, I think the AF is almost always drawn into this, like, well, we're trying to get our perm back, okay? Like, perm, we must get this permutation, rather than we must attack the fact that they're trying to make these arguments about, like, if they win these arguments, how likely are we to win our permutation? Near zero, right? So like instead of treating all of these as ways to get back just to like perm, okay? You want to instead treat it as these are reasons that you should reject the way in which they phrased these arguments as prior to the case, right? If what we should think about is specific histories and instances, then that also brings back in those AF cards about like, in this instance, this is why this action is appropriate. And it attacks their argument about ontology and epistemology. Similar style card, slightly different language that is worth considering. Get you the sites. And one. Theorization of settler colonialism is indicative of these tensions. Activists and academics have recently taken up settler colonialism as an analytic to address particular ways in which colonialism operates, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, as well as Israel, Palestine. Much of the work that has become associated with settler colonial studies has already been underway in Native American indigenous studies. Note, those are being contrasted. As in, Native American studies and indigenous studies, those are not the sources of origin for settler colonial theory. Settler colonial theory attempted to distinguish itself from some of those prior existing disciplines by saying there's this thing, settler colonialism, that is distinct and separate that has to be considered differently. We suggest that when settler colonialism is deployed as a standalone analytic, it potentially reproduces precisely the effects and enactments of colonial unknowing that we are theorizing. Approaches to the analysis of settler colonialism as isolated from imperialism and differential modes of racialization are consequences of the institutionalization of this work as a distinct subfield, which is claimed and consolidated through analytic tendencies that foreclose or bracket out interconnections and relational possibilities. Settler colonial histories, conditions, practices, and logics of disposition and power must necessarily be understood as relationally constituted to other modes of imperialism, racial capitalism, and historical forms of social difference. Settler colonial studies have also led to a tendency to focus on this distinction as constituting a discrete and modular form or ensemble of practices. Wolff's off-cited contention that settler colonialism destroys to replace that can be applied across differences of geography or time. As such, settler colonialism appears to be a self-contained type rather than a situatedly specific formation that is co-constituted with other forms and histories of colonialism, counterclaims, and relations of power. Okay? Drawing an absolute distinction between structure and event, discarding a focus on the historicity of settler colonialism, neglects some of the ways Wolff distinguishes between the binary terms structure and event in service of other analysis. A categorical event-structure binary banishes deeply engaged historical knowledge from the landscape, turning away from historical materialism, devolving into a scholastic debate over identities and standpoints that are reduced to structural essences and divorced from politics or contingency. Meaning, you could basically read the essentialism K of this binary and the idea of a logic of assimilation. So you have, like, on the terms of epistemology, or like, notice, winning some of these arguments then does not require, like, it has offense versus the negs framework without requiring you to beat that framework by winning plan focus. Because this set of cards says, yeah, exactly, like the epistemic, you know, the techniques and who gets to produce what knowledge and what we consider to be legitimate knowledge, those arguments are very important, and if you evaluated them, you would reject the premises of settler colonial theory that the neg is using. You would reject the binary between structure versus event. You would reject the notion of a coherent logic of elimination that operates the same across place and time. And you would reject the notion that settler native is a binary that structures all of the other aspects of a settler society. Excuse me. Okay. How many of you have seen this card? It was read in the demo debate, yeah? Okay. Here I want to talk a little bit about kind of AF tactics as opposed to AF strategy, okay? Do we see that this is a pretty good card linked to the notion of refusal? Okay, because that's, hopefully this terminology makes more sense to you now why this card is written in this way, right? Some critical indigenous political theorists reject all state overtures towards reconciliation and take extremely pessimistic approaches. They advocate the indigenous resurgence through a return to indigenous land-based forms of governance as the only path to decolonization. Okay, do we now understand what every one of those terms means? Okay, so like why resurgence is being contrasted with reconciliation there, why land is being treated as the focal point of all political claims, okay, and why this is connected to the state, and the notion that the state is a settler state. Okay, so we're on the same page? Okay. Notice, this is like a chapter, okay, in which Lightfoot is trying to indicate that there are several different aspects to the pessimism trap, okay? Clear demarcation of indigenous individuals into only two categories, authentic and co-opted. Where does the division of indigenous people into authentic versus co-opted, where do we have that up on the board right now? And where, what card previously mentioned an example that could be an example of why we should not kind of fall into this binary? What do we do with the participants in colonial administration? Like, do we treat them as like they are only agents of assimilation? Have they become settlers? Are they like that? This binary is not very helpful in understanding some aspects of colonial administration. Okay, but like that you're entirely separate from or entirely co-opted. Not too great. Pessimism track 2. The state is unified, deliberate, and unchanging in its desire to dispossess. Okay, that's logic of elimination and dispossession. Yeah. Okay, huge section there. Pessimism track 3, engagement with the state is futile. More underlying stuff here. Okay, references to UNDRIP and the rights of indigenous people. So when I say that I want to focus for a second on tactics rather than strategy, how many of you have had a debate in which you have read this card on the affirmative? Okay. How did it go?
Well,
What is difficult about having a card like this? So we agree this card is useful, like it sets up a bunch of the terms. Why isn't it that this card, like why does this card not win more debates? Because it answers several different parts of the negative argument, right? Like it answers the ontological binary between settler and native. It answers the idea that reconciliation or some instances of recognition or cooperation with the settler state, it treats those as not necessarily involving elimination. So like why doesn't this card win all of these debates? Or what is one of the things that is difficult to execute about this evidence?
maybe Meredith can say something about how using the opinion of one indigenous person doesn't account for what most indigenous people think.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the way that I would answer that argument is that it goes through a long set of citations here on, all of the different case studies that are being deployed to make these arguments. So I don't actually think we're talking about the work of only one person. But yeah, that could be an objection. How many of you have had the experience of 2AC reads a long theoretical card about the negatives argument? The 1AR extends the, what is the tagline most often used to extend this card in the 1AR? Or a card like this? I have two proposals. Proposal 1, how many think that this card might get extended as settler colonial theory is wrong? Okay. How many think that this card might get extended as sometimes the state is okay? Okay. Do we see why it's like, if our tag for this card and the extension in the 1AR is sometimes the state is okay, or settler colonial theory is wrong, have we applied it to any of the terminology of the negative argument other than the term settler colonialism? No. So part of the reason that we started with all of this stuff on the neg to begin with, okay, that 30 minutes at the beginning of this elective is this a single piece of evidence like this that is long, the reason that extending it in the 1AR is so difficult is applying all of its terminology to the negative's strategic terminology takes an enormous amount of effort. The blocks that you should be writing on the app versus most critiques should, and I don't take this too literally, okay, obviously you need a 2AC block to settler colonialism. Much more important in some ways, or just like much more difficult to execute, is you need 1AR extensions for this style of card. If I were debating one-off settler colonialism and reading like the Indigenous Cooperation AF written by one of the labs, or co-production written by our lab, okay, and I were writing a 1AR block for this card, it would be a 1AR block that would probably contain somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute of arguments. And it would be divided into, like, for one, notice, this is already like 3 or 4 different claims even in the card. And are there also multiple warrants for each of those claims? Like, are there case studies and examples for each of them? And is there terminology that could be applied to the negative? So like, this card should be used to say you should reject their framework. The ontological distinction between settler and native should not be used. That the epistemic appeal to the notion that settler colonial studies or theory, can identify certain forms of Western knowledge as illegitimate. Okay, all of those arguments are contained within here. But if this is extended as settler colonial theory wrong or state sometimes okay, we have done nothing to displace the negative's terminology about how the judge should decide when thinking about like instances of the use of the settler state. We've just made an argument, sometimes it is okay. We have done nothing to attack the negative's underlying theoretical terminology. So some of these longer theoretical cards, you need to have an entire 1AR block written, and ideally, okay, both the 2A and the 1A, and this is true for like several of these longer cards on settler colonial theory. If I were reading any of these AFs that are, kind of designed to be pro-Indigenous cooperation, the real way to get cross-exed on this card and to use it effectively is to have read every single ununderlined portion of this evidence and know the case studies in detail, such that you could reference several of them in cross-ex, and that you could put some of them in a 1AR block or underline specific examples where necessary. Because otherwise, there is no way to extend this card other than, well, we read a card that says settler colonial theory is wrong. And that is unlikely to get it done, okay? So part of the way that you can transform the what does the 2AR sound like when instead of saying settler colonial theory wrong, it has all of these detailed arguments about why we should not think that the state is governed by a singular logic of elimination, that the ontological categories of settler and native are woefully inadequate for thinking about the history of colonialism, and that the epistemic distinction between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge is one that isn't supported by the history of law and politics and colonialism. Like, those are just the tags for my claims, right? Those all need to be filled out with like a full paragraph worth of arguments for the most part, or at the very least, multiple warrants that support each of those claims. Do you see how it's like, if the 2NR gets to a block that is written like that, and they say, well, we won that ontology is first, or apply, the framework of settler colonial studies means that you should not consider any of these different case studies because there is an underlying logic of elimination. It's very difficult for the negative to simply kind of group all of our arguments together on, well, we read 3 cards that say settler colonial theory is right. Yeah? So that's the way, just tactically thinking about why giving a speech like this versus a lot of these one-off arguments is very difficult, is detail breaks down in the 1AR because these longer 2AC cards get extended as a single tag rather than as somewhere between 45 seconds to like a minute 15 worth of arguments. If you invested this much 2AC time in reading a card like this. Note, the other way that this happens is if the 1A executes the extension of this card by following the block order rather than referencing the 2AC order. If you are distributing your time based on how the block distributes their time in these debates, you are doing yourself a disfavor, because you need to be able to, you read a card that has implications for every major strategic category that the NEG is trying to deploy. So extending it off the basis of the 2AC is the most efficient way to then apply it to each of those other categories, rather than wait to try and chop it up in all of the different kind of areas that the NEG has referenced with their arguments. Which is almost the opposite of the way that I see everybody do it right now. Couple minutes for questions before you head to your next elective. Anything that people wanted to cover or expected to cover here that we didn't?
So,
You write down some of these sites.
Could you, what was the first card you showed? Like before
That Iverson card.
Yeah, I got that.
This, like I said, this isn't the card that I would be reading. Like, this is more like I wanted to show people that there are liberals who write about colonialism, right? Like that. We just oftentimes we're throwing that one around in debate as like, oh, it's basically like, oh, you know, liberal political. What do these idiots have to say? Like, well, this is it. They don't write. They tend to write in less power-worded language, like that. They're using the concept of like, because they are writing from a perspective that's like pluralism. You know, we live in a plural society where we have to like negotiate a bunch of different visions. That like that's part of the reason that they're not written in uncompromising language and not as powerfully worded. Your mileage may vary on the usage of cards like that. Two other sites that I would consider just like writing down and reading for this. So like Lightfoot is a good one. I would take a look at this article from Jacobin, Aziz Rana, who's a major constitutional legal thinker in the U.S., and Nikhil Paul Singh, who's similarly kind of writes in the intersection between law and colonialism. And then one major category that we didn't get to that we could, but is maybe a little bit less relevant for the ways that some of these Arctic AFs are written, is there are significant criticisms of land focus, or a focus on land as the only analytic for understanding colonialism. The kind of the most forceful one that I've seen, this is an older site. This is a book chapter that she then turned in. She has a book of her own that is much larger and longer on land focus. That's Nandita Sharma. She might be somebody to look at. I didn't talk about land focus on the AF here that much because given that many of the AFs that you might be debating this position on are AFs that make claims about the importance of relationships to the land, then like K of land focus is not all that important for that set of AFs, but just like be aware that this category of arguments exists. This is the major answer to all that matters is land return. Or this is an example of what one of those might look like. Any last question before you go? Okay. Enjoy your last elective.